is evidence, elekos. It is evidence in the sense of proof which results in conviction. Now, the difference between the substance or assurance of the first part of the verse and the evidence or conviction of the last part may seem minimal, but the contrast within the verse focuses upon the qualifying phrases of things hoped for and the other one of things not seen. The first involves future hopes. The second involves present realities which are unseen. The first includes the hope of the resurrection, the return of Christ, and the glorification of the saints.
Focuses on one of our most
the second involves unseen realities, such as the forgiveness of sin through Christ's sacrifice and the present intercession of Christ in heaven.
How high or low a particular sound is.
Hope is faith relating to the future.
Really interesting musical
Conviction is faith relating
Here's a basic example of pitch. I'm going to play two pitches. You decide.
Because of faith, objective reality is not required.
Here's number one.
Faith is the affirmative response to God's will and word.
If you pick two,
man possesses faith when he takes God at his word. One does not need to see something to believe it.
Interval describes the
faith is the acceptance of something merely because God has said it. Blessed are they that have not seen and yet have believed, said Jesus in John 20.
So which one was higher this time?
For these Jewish readers and us as well, faith must involve Jesus.
By describing how many
for as the Son of God, he is the revelation and redemption for man. Therefore, our writer later concludes this treatise on faith with these words, looking unto Jesus, the writer and finisher of our faith.
Is what allows us to play in tune with each other.
Faith is
also
necessary,
what allows electronic guitar tuners and
for it underlies both our future hopes and present spiritual blessings.
To agree on how many vibrations a second.
It is faith alone that makes the lives of these Old Testament individuals worth noting.
They then sound good.
In fact,
they're all playing exactly
faith is absolutely necessary if we are to understand even the first
and higher
pages of Scripture.
The overall range of human hearing is about
Verse 3 begins our study of faith at the right phase, not with the history of Moses or Abraham, but with the creation as revealed in Genesis 1. No man was present to witness the creation. It must be accepted by faith.
Sometimes called infrasound. Just like infrared.
I know science spends a lot of time trying to figure out the age of the Earth, and I know that science has an age of Earth that's way older than probably the Earth really is. If you study enough Scripture, you get an idea about how old the Earth really is. If you were to present that to a person who is ostensibly scientific, they would scoff at you. They would laugh.
Let's say A is 440 hertz.
They don't know any more than we do.
Happens every time we hear a frequency that is
simply do not.
Half of this.
One of the problems that I've always had with science is science expresses the ability to be able to prove something through a process of replicating it in a laboratory.
They sound so similar, don't they?
If the Earth is millions of years old, show me that replication.
Amazing.
Show me in your laboratory the millions of years old it is.
This is a very
we don't need that because we have faith.
It is an important
we believe
of how
Scripture.
Our minds interpret sound.
We know what it says.
440, you hear a tone that, in this case,
through faith, we understand that the worlds were framed by the Word of God. The word translated worlds, Ionis, which means ages, refers to the ages or dispensations. Though the word has mainly a temporal idea, it involves the physical world that is united with time.
So
the Word of God is the one who framed outline the ages and all that is in them. His Word, Rhema, was the creative instrument. He spoke and it came into being.
And then A again.
He created Bara out of nothing. so that things which are seen were not made
to a certain degree.
of things
in
which
the Western system, we divide
appear.
it into 8 parts, and
You
therefore
gather up all these little pieces and say, boom,
culture and be divided
here's
into
creation.
a number of parts.
It came out of
the
nothing.
endpoints are always the same.
The book of Genesis
Doubling
explains the
half
events of this creation, and that explanation must be accepted through faith.
Here's an example of this. You should be able to hear a pattern repeating here. I'm going to play A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and then I'm going to play it again, A, B, C, D,
Pre-patriarchal
E, F, G,
examples,
and
chapter 11, verses 4 through 7.
I think you'll
By
be able to
faith,
hear
Abel,
these 7 notes are repeating
who isn't
at different
present today.
octaves, but in fact they are the same 7 notes over and over again.
Little nod there. Let him know I said that. The writer begins.
I sure will.
See what happens when you don't show
the
up?
last term of pitch range.
The right.
Pitch range is just a description of the lowest and highest tones of voice.
Just so the rest of you know, he's not required to be here.
This is valuable information for a composer.
The writer begins his roll call of the faithful by focusing
Really embarrassing to ask a violin player
by focusing upon the first man in the biblical record to demonstrate
It's not very likely
faith.
that a composer
Abel's faith was demonstrated in that he offered unto God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain.
Usually, pitch range is
In what way
described
was
in a
his
certain number of
sacrifice
octaves.
better?
So Mariah Carey,
Was it
for
because
instance, has
his
a
was
really
animal
impressive vocal
and
range,
Cain's
a vocal
vegetable?
pitch range, which spans a
Or is
whopping
his a
5
firstling
octaves.
and Cain's not the first fruit?
Just to
Or
compare
his
an
with
instrument,
blood
for
and
instance,
Cain's
the
without?
pitch range of most guitars is about 3.5.
Genesis 4 helps us understand our text. Genesis states that God had respect unto Abel and to his offering,
an interval,
and
which is
that
how we
God
describe
did
the
not
distance between two
receive
sounds.
Cain
The octave,
and his
which is a
offering.
very special property.
In other
of
words,
sound
it
in
was
the way
not
that our
just
minds
the
interpret
offering
it,
that made
which
one
basically
acceptable
is
and
we
the
hear
other
the same
unacceptable.
color of tone
Since God
every time
accepted
the
both
pitch
grain
doubles
and
in
animal
frequency.
offerings
And in the
according to
Western
their
system, we divide
purposes.
that into 8 parts.
But it was the character of the person that made one offering acceptable and the other not. Both Hebrews and Genesis stress that point. In Hebrews it is witnessed that Abel offered by faith. Obviously Cain did not. Genesis records that even before the rejection of his offering, Cain's heart was not right with God. And look at Genesis 4:7 if you don't believe that. Now, this could have been because the offering was not as stipulated, but we have nothing that clearly so states. God's acceptance of Abel's offering was a witness that he was righteous. He being dead yet speaketh. This statement may suggest an allusion to Abel's blood speaking from the ground. More likely, Abel's testimony of faith, given so long ago, still speaks to us. The second example of a pre-Jewish saint is Enoch. Genesis 5 briefly records the life of this man of God. By faith he was translated, never experiencing death because he pleased God. The verb pleased, euaristeo, is the Septuagint rendering of the Hebrew phrase to walk with. Enoch pleased God in that he walked with God. Thus our writer concludes that without faith it is impossible to please God. One cannot please God without walking in the light of truth and in righteousness before God. By faith, Noah. Noah was asked by God to do things in faith which were incongruous with what he had formerly experienced. He had never seen rain. Can you imagine a time when there was no rain and all of a sudden
rain came.
Yeah, how weird that must have felt.
It was Noah the one that got swallowed by the big fish?
Huh?
That was Joe who?
No, Jonah.
Oh, Jonah.
Yeah, it was Jonah.
Noah had the ark.
Yep, and thank you for saying it is big fish, because a lot of people say whale. A whale couldn't have swallowed a man, according to the way they're built. Yeah, it says big fish. Okay. So, and yet God told him to build an ark because of a coming flood. It's like, what's rain? What's flood? Gonna find out. But Noah took it on faith, by the which he condemned the world. The word which allows either faith or ark as its antecedent, whatever led up to it. The better idea is that in sharp contrast to the godlessness, big one there, of the world, Noah's faith condemned it. Those are pre-patriarchal examples. Now we'll have some patriarchal examples. By faith, Abraham. Extended portions of this chapter are allotted for the faith of the two prominent Old Testament fathers, Abraham and Moses. The first recorded incident involving Abraham's faith was when he left Ur of the Chaldees. That act involved great faith, for he left family and friends to go to a place he had never seen, not knowing what it was like or how to get there. He went merely because God had told him to go, and he obeyed. In 1991, my wife told me to go to Oxnard. I obeyed. She wasn't God. But I sure didn't want to come out to Southern California to live. But it's been good. I became a Christian in Southern California. Hello. Imagine that. It's quite stark when you think about that. Who goes to Southern California and becomes a Christian? Hopefully all of you. It happened to me. And my wife and my family. By faith he sojourned. Yet, even after Abraham received the promise of this land, he never possessed it. The only property he owned in Canaan was the burial plot at Machpelah. The verb sojourn, paroikeo, means to migrate. He was a nomad. An interesting contrast is found in the verb dwelling, katoikeo. Okay. Which means to dwell permanently or to settle down. The only thing permanent about Abraham's dwelling was that he always lived in a tent. Still, he continued to look for a city that God would build. By faith, he expected that city, so he never returned to Ur, not even to Haran. Sarah's faith in the birth of Isaac may seem out of place here. When she first heard the announcement, she laughed in unbelief. Still, she did have faith and cooperated in carrying out God's promise. This necessitated considerable faith, for she was a woman who had been barren all her life, and she was now 90 years old. God's promise came to pass, and he who as good as dead became the father of a great nation. The whole Jewish nation is the product of a miracle birth. The Messiah, of whom Isaac was a type, would also be the product of a miraculous birth. More than anyone else, a Jew ought to be able to accept the supernatural birth of Jesus, for he himself is the result of Isaac's miraculous birth. These all died in faith is obviously a summary of only verses 8 through 12, for these refers to the patriarch and his seed, who had received the promises but never possessed the land. Enoch is no contradiction to this statement, since he was not one of these who were pilgrims. These had enough faith to recognize the promises of God from afar off. The point of these verses is that Abraham, after he had finally received the Son of God's promise, now, when he was tried, offered up Isaac. This was his only begotten son, monogamy, which must be understood as his unique or one-of-a-kind son. Abraham had other sons, but Isaac was the miraculous son through whom God would fulfill his promises. And compare Abraham's other unique descendant. You can look that up in John 3:16. Okay. By this time in life, Abraham's faith was so strong that he could believe that God would raise Isaac from the dead, though he had never seen such a miracle. He totally trusted God to do all things well, from whence also he received him in a figure. Though Abraham was stopped before the actual slaying of his son, Isaac was as good as dead. Here he serves as a parabole, of a literal resurrection. This incident prefigured the resurrection of Abraham's ultimate seed, Jesus Christ. The writer briefly expresses the faith of the other patriarchs. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau. Even though these events of the book of Genesis seem to involve deceit rather than faith, Isaac's part was in faith in that he was accomplishing God's will. Likewise, Jacob's blessings of both sons of Joseph involved faith, for it also involved the carrying out of God's promise. The choice of these particular events from the lives of Isaac and Jacob to serve as the one demonstration of this faith. One demonstration of this faith surely demonstrates the intimacy between faith and God's will and word. Yet even more amazing is the accompanying statement that Jacob did this leaning upon the top of his staff. The reason for this statement probably lies in the fact that nothing depicted Jacob's dedication and faith more dramatically than his staff. Evidently, Jacob's life of surrender and faith began the night he wrestled with the Lord at Peniel. God put Jacob's thigh out of joint that night as a reminder of their encounter. Jacob's staff was a daily reminder of God's promises, and his life of faith was best symbolized by his staff. Similarly, Joseph's faith is also united with the promise God made with the patriarchs. For though he spent most of his life in Egypt, Joseph gave commandment concerning his bones that they should be carried back to the promised land. Examples from Moses and at Jericho. In verses 23 through 26, by faith Moses' ellipsis was hid. This, of course, is not the faith of Moses, but that faith which was exercised by his parents at his birth. How much his parents understood concerning the imminent completion of Israel's 400 years in Egyptian bondage, or the part Moses would play in Israel's deliverance, is impossible to imagine. Yet somehow, through faith, they responded to God's leading. By faith, Moses made his break with the world and was willing to suffer with the people of God. The same thing our writer is attempting to get his readers to do. The writer of Hebrews. Moses knew that the pleasure of sin lasts only for a season, and he reckoned the reproach of Christ greater than the treasures of Egypt. Moses did know of the coming Messiah and was willing to bear reproach on his behalf. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king. Moses left Egypt twice. First for Midian, and 40 years later at the Exodus. His first departure was a hasty flight because of his fear. 40 years later, he had learned to walk by faith and did not fear the entire Egyptian nation. The second departure must be understood as the correct one, even though it puts the next event of faith out of order. By faith, Moses kept the Passover, which is mentioned in verse 28 before his departure spoken of in verse 27. The last example of Moses' faith demonstrates that faith is not a daring leap in the dark. Faith is man's response to God's command. Thus, by faith, Israel passed through the Red Sea, but when the Egyptians mustered enough audacity to try it, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell. Surely neither the marching, but by faith they persisted in obedience to God's command. Similarly, within the city, faith also delivered the life of Rahab the harlot. And though Rahab's faith delivered her, it was her works, James says, that demonstrated her to be righteous, justified her. Although her epithet as a harlot lingered, her life changed. Examples from the judges, kings, and prophets. Verses 32 through 38 starts with, "And what shall I more say?" The writer wants to go on, but time constrains him. So many more deserve recognition. These verses list mighty deeds of faith done by those of biblical history. Surely David is an example of one who subdued kingdoms and wrought righteousness, in that he executed judgment and justice unto all his people. Daniel stopped the mouths of lions, although in a lesser sense so did Samson and David. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. By the way, that name Abednego, did you hear how I pronounced it? No, not Abednego. There's no bending in that word. Okay? It's Abednego. Abednego. Okay. Abednego. If you learn nothing else today, learn that, and that way I can walk out of here with a clear conscience that I taught something.
You got that.
Okay. Quench the violence of fire. Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, was stoned. According to tradition, Isaiah was sawn asunder. These are but a few examples of those who endured because of faith. Number 6, the conclusion. The important thing is that these all participated in their faith even though they received not the promise. Genuine faith persists unto the end. Emotional decisions do not. True faith continues to believe the truth. Once again, the writer shows the superiority of the new covenant. God saved this better thing or fulfillment of the promise for this age. In fact, without those of the new covenant, even the mightiest champion of faith in the Old Testament could not be made perfect. I was pretty much a horrible student in school. I do consider it point blank a miracle that I graduated from high school. And I didn't know that it was a miracle until I became a Christian, and I got to pondering such things. Why did you let me graduate from high school, God? I sure as heck didn't deserve it. Part of my testimony, when I read a published testimony, I have different testimonies, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes if you want to listen to 20 minutes of it. But one of the things that I say in there is that the one thing I excelled at when I was in school, the one thing that I could do better than anybody else probably in the entire school, perhaps even in the entire school system, maybe even in the entire county, and maybe as far as the state. And if there was a competition at the federal level, I excelled in one thing, and that was detention. And when I hit that word detention, everybody just yeah, I never played football. I banged my head so many times before I was old enough to play sports. I wasn't allowed to play sports. But my detention was almost always with the football coach. Because he's got to be there afterwards anyway, so he's kind of the detention king. So whenever and there were 3 or 4 of us got detention quite often, we'd be along the sidelines. And sometimes we'd just walk away, find out the next day that we had some more detention because of not completing that detention. And the reason I bring that up is because I'm standing before you right now teaching. I'm standing before you right now teaching with some qualification because this syllabus that I'm reading from and hopefully accenting well is Dr. Welch's, and I attended his college, and I did get, this is the first school in my life that I attended willingly. Now, the Air Force put me through a couple of schools, and of course that's different. You will go. Okay. Or you will be summarily court-martialed and discharged. Take your pick. But the willingly going to school in the first place, that was simply moving me along the path. I had accepted Christ by then. But I also wanted to be able to accept Christ and just kick back, relax, and wait till I die and go to heaven, and everything will be fine. I didn't expect that he expected that I was going to do some work. And even today, the word work, frankly, is somewhat abhorrent to me. But nonetheless, there are some works that I do enjoy, and certainly being here is one of them. Because I don't have to be here. I'm not, but I love being here. I love teaching. I teach on Tuesday nights at a campus of a Bible college called Golden Grain Bible College and Seminary. I'm going to be teaching Greek 1, actually. We've got past introductory Greek. We're actually going to start teaching some real Greek as well. But I love teaching, Whether I do it well or not, well, that's pretty much up to God to do that. But Dr. Welch had a specific curriculum. You had to do these courses whether you liked them or not. And I got to be honest with you, textual criticism. Has anybody ever taken a course called textual criticism? Yeah. That's one of those where you're in dire, deadly peril of having broken noses in the class because you fall asleep so quickly. And your face just slams down on the desk. I've never had to teach that. Don't know whether I'd ever want to. But it compares a lot of how the Scripture came into being. By the way, that's a good segue for you've heard me use the word Septuagint. Does anybody know what the Septuagint is? No. Septuagint. Thank you. I've only used it about maybe 100, 150 times since I've been coming here. The Septuagint is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. So the Old Testament was written completely in Hebrew. And then some people got together and decided that they were going to translate it, but they were going to translate it into Greek, Koine Greek specifically, New Testament Greek, the Greek that was in use to write the New Testament. And so it's always there. So every time we say Septuagint, we're not talking about something that, it's not going to be in English. It's entirely in Greek. In fact, when I compare the Greek with the Greek that I pick up on King James and the Greek version of the King James, the version of the version. Does that make sense? I'm not sure what to do. The translation of the version into Greek, they look dramatically different. But when we refer to Septuagint, that's what we're talking about. Somebody took the Hebrew.
All right, so this segment of our Elements of Music
Jewish
unit
version,
covers another basic property of
the Old
sound,
Testament,
how
and
loud
converted
or
it
soft it
into,
is. We have lots of
Koine
ways
Greek.
of describing what's happening with
Koine
volume
Greek is
in a piece of music,
again, the language
and we refer
of
to
the
that
New
whole
Testament.
set of different terms as
Many of
dynamics.
you remember, I'm sure
These
I
serve
must
as
have
both
talked about
directions
Koine
to
Greek
musicians
somewhere along the way.
when they're reading or
Anybody
playing a
remember
piece of
that?
music, and also
All right,
are the
I did
terms we
another
use when we
lecture.
want to talk about
Okay.
what we hear. One way to
Koine
use
Greek.
dynamics is to draw attention to a note
300
by
years
making
before
it
the
suddenly
birth of
louder
Christ, there was
than
a
its
guy named
neighbors.
Alexander the Great.
This symbol
Does that
looks
ring a bell
like a
with
greater
anybody?
than marking, which kind of makes
Alexander the
sense
Great.
since it's a greater amount of sound given to that one
Conquered
note.
all of the known world.
Here's what this looks like and sounds
Part
like
of the
in a piece of
difficulty that he
music.
had in conquering
There are two
all of
notes
the
here.
new
The
world,
first one
or
is
the
given
known
the
world,
accent.
excuse me,
You might recognize this tune.
was that people spoke different languages. Can you imagine that? Different countries, they speak different languages. Okay? Dr. Welch refers to this style of speaking, sanctified sarcasm. Says Paul, if you ever read the book of Paul, he's got a lot of sanctified sarcasm in there. Little children, he's not saying little children, he's saying little children, more like that, you know. Anyway, Alexander the Great discovered that he was having some problems getting his commands properly understood. And when you're at the top of the heap and we have something in the military called chain of command, okay, you got the officers and then you got the enlisted, and by the time you get everything translated down to the lowest level, somebody's got to pick up the gun and shoot it. And Aoric, Ionic, darn if I can remember what the third one was, but it's ordinary Greek. He put all three of these languages together, and then he created a little book. It was kind of like a tactician's book, How to Wage War. Use these commands. And that became the language in which the New Testament was written. It's not classic Greek, it's not Ionic Greek, it's not Aoric Greek, it's Koine Greek that he invented. One of the bigger difficulties he had was that the battle plans for each skirmish that he got himself involved in were being sold before the battle began. Well, if everybody knows how you're going to wage that war, that battle, easy to defeat. Do all of these things instead, you know? So what he further developed, he developed when he set the ships to go sailing to the country that he was getting ready to overtake, he would send the ships away with no battle plan. The captain of the ship had no instructions except to head out to sea. When they headed out to sea, I gotta think of the word here. What is the word? Okay. When they headed out to sea, he had a man who had the battle plan, who would then jump on the old-fashioned version of a cigarette boat, a speedboat, to get out there real fast, lots of oarsmen and whatever else, get on board the ship, hand the captain the battle plan at that time. He would open it, you would then know what the order of battle is. And he enjoyed many, many more successes of the countries that he was taking over. And the word for that person that carried the battle plan onto the ship was apostolon. What does that sound like to you?
Apostle?
Yeah, exactly. The word apostle came from that. Apostolon.
Does it say he went by himself, or
Huh?
does it say he went by himself? The apostolon?
No, Astolan was
Yeah, the apostolon was one person. One person. Only one person had the battle plan. Alexander would say, here's the battle plan. Now the reality is, if that person sold that battle plan, he would have been executed pretty quickly.
You got executed.
Would have gotten court-martialed. Well, he probably would have shot him. I don't know. It never happened. You know, back then, military justice was boom, you're dead. You know, whatever. Except they didn't have guns; they had spears. But that's the Koine Greek, and the New Testament is written in the Koine Greek. Okay, and it was written in a format that anybody who read Jesus' words, if you will, would be able to understand it at that time. Keeping in mind that this language was already in effect for 300 years. Okay? All right. Thank you for letting me go on that little trip. Septuagint. So we know about Septuagint. We know about Alexander the Great, Koine Greek language, and derivation of the word apostle. Apostolon. Apostolon. Which one of those are we at now? B?
Yeah.
Good. It's easy for me to see that one. Okay. Exhortation to perseverance and holiness. Chapter 12 sets forth the practical aspect of this book of exhortation. Prior to chapter 11, the primary emphasis was doctrinal, with a lesser place given to exhortation. Chapter 11 began the practical section of the book by parading many Old Testament examples of faith and patience. Now, chapter 12, building upon those examples, begins the extensive exhortations of this epistle. Chapter 13 also contains many exhortations, but they are general admonitions which are not directly based upon the thought developed in the earlier chapters. So 12 verses 1 through 4, the supreme example of endurance. Wherefore, ellipsis, let us run, expresses the exhortation and hence the main idea of verse 1. The exhortation finds its ground or basis within the examples of the champions mentioned in chapter 11. These here, you can see it there as well, are imagined by some to be spectators, theatai, which look like the word theater. But during the terrible days of martyrdom, starting the New Testament era, this word became the common terms for identifying those who testified through their death. In our verse, these witnesses testified to the need for a persistent faith through their lives. These saints may also be spectators, and some were surely martyrs, yet the emphasis of this verse, in harmony with the choice of martyron, is upon the witness their lives demonstrated. We also need to run as they ran. The writer is emphatic about this point. What they have done, we must do. Let us run. Whereas the Christian's position involves a sitting in the heavenlies with Christ, and his conduct is as a walk, his activity or service is described as the running of a race. Let us run is the only cohortative, that means an incitement to be associated together, form in the Greek text. Let us lay aside every weight as an aorist participle used circumstantially. Don't get too hung up on some of those words. I don't test any of you if you don't know that. Thank God, yes. Absolutely. Oh, you should see me when I test.
No, I'm saying for me, that's good.
Probably telling us how we are to run by laying aside every weight. The action of the aorist participle must precede the action of the main verb, let us run. We are to run by laying aside every weight and the sin which does beset us. The weight, akos, used only here, refers to that which impedes or burdens by weighing one down. For a runner, it could either refer to clothing. It could either refer to clothing or training weights. Obviously, for the Christian, it would involve not wicked but weighty things. It would include anything that could hinder his effectiveness for service. These are not things which are inherently wrong, but for the diligent runner or the faithful Christian, they are an impediment that must be removed. The Christian is not allowed to be selective regarding these weights. He will remove them. He must put off every weight. Whatever does not aid in the race is a weight and must be cast aside. The second thing which must be put off is of itself morally wrong, for it is sin. The adjective that describes this sin is not found anywhere else in the New Testament. It is translated easily beset or easily entangles. The use of the Greek article identifies some specific sin which easily besets each of us. This does not refer to some universal sin, but it refers to one sin above all others that defeats one's Christian life. This will be a different sin for each Christian. For one person, it may be a sensual lust. For another, it may be material. Or for another, ego. That sin must be put off in order to run the race which God has placed before us. The casting off of every weight and the entangling sin refers to what one must do before he can seriously run the race. The use of the aorist participle also suggests that understanding. They might even have been translated having put off every weight. Now, after the race has begun, we are encouraged to run with patience, hypomones. Since patience is not an attribute commonly associated with running, this word must be better translated as endurance. Endurance is a quality that every distance runner must develop. It is amazing that this translation was not used, since the cognate verb used in verses 2 and 3 is translated endured. Endurance and persistence have been upon the mind of the writer since the end of the chapter. Chapter 10, excuse me. We must run with endurance, for a race has no rest stops. It knows no vacations. Number 2, just as verse 1 establishes some qualities for the entrance and actual running of the race, so verse 2 directs our eyes to the finish line. Looking, aphorao, is an uncommon word that literally means to look intently or to fix one's eyes or so to gaze. Our gaze or attention is to be focused upon Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. He has marked the trail for us and has completed the course. Though chapter 11 has provided us with heroes to emulate, we must bear in mind that they have a course distinct from our own. Our supreme example is Jesus himself. So the Christian is to run every course that has been placed before him with endurance, as Christ endured the cross for the joy that was set before him. The usual translation of the preposition for, ante, is instead of. Thus, some would understand this to say that Christ took the different course rather than the courses that led directly to joy, an idea parallel to Philippians 2. However, the context favors the other concept, for the sake of. As Jesus fixed his gaze upon the joy which lay at the end of the course, so we must fix our gaze upon Jesus. For as the finisher of our faith, he is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. As Jesus was dying on the cross, He said the words, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? He knew what the end of his course was, and the time on the cross was not the end of his course. The end of his course was sitting down at the right hand of God. And he was able to know that. And so even though he uttered those words of despair, he knew, I'm there. And then he died. And with that, we'll be finished for the day. Would someone now care to close us in prayer so you can go participate in a sumptuous repast?
Father God, we come to you in the name of your Son Jesus Christ. Just thanking you, Father God, for the word that was shared with us. We ask that you mature it in our hearts, Father God, and you use it to prepare us to as we live this life with you. We just thank you, Father God, for the mercy that you've shown us, the grace that you have upon our lives, and the protection that you have upon all of us. We just pray that you continue to work on us and fulfill your will in our lives. In Jesus' name we pray.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you. All right. I'll see you next week if things continue as they are.